Steward stopped counting how many days he had been on this planet. It didn't matter. The cycle of survival was always the same. Find shelter, ration supplies, avoid the worst of the storms, and stay alive long enough to see another day. This world had no name worth remembering. If it ever had one, it had been buried beneath the sandstorms and wreckage that littered the surface. The air was thin and dry, stinging the back of his throat. The wind carried a metallic tang, the ghost of whatever had once burned here long before he arrived. The sky was a dull, rust-colored stretch of nothingness, its twin suns sinking toward the jagged horizon. Soon the real danger would come. Stu sat by the weak embers of his fire, back against the wreckage of an old transport pod. He wasn't truly resting, just waiting, listening. Something was off tonight. The air felt too still. The wind had died down, but it wasn't the usual suffocating silence of this dead world. This was a waiting silence, a watching silence. His hand drifted toward the knife at his belt, his instincts tightening like a spring wound too long. And then there it was, a sound so faint it could have been the shifting sand. But Stu knew better, the scuff of small, hesitant footsteps, the soft scrape of something moving between metal debris, trying to be silent but not quite succeeding. He didn't react immediately. Years of experience had taught him that the moment you let someone know you've seen them, the dynamic shifts. Instead, he kept his posture relaxed, only his eyes moving. There, a flicker of motion at the edge of the fire's glow. Small, not an adult, not a scavenger, a child. The kid's frame was too thin, his limbs wrapped in tattered cloth that barely clung to his body. His skin was an unnatural shade of deep blue, his tangled white hair falling in front of wide, searching eyes. A survivor. Stu didn't move, not yet. The boy crept forward, gaze darting between Stu and the supply stack beside him. His hands trembled, not from fear but from hunger. The fire cracked. The boy flinched, but didn't run. His fingers twitched. Stu saw the moment he made the choice. The kid lunged for the food. Stu moved fast, faster than the boy expected. The kid froze. For a brief moment, they locked eyes, the boy's pale, terrified gaze meeting Stu's steady, unreadable one. Then instinct took over. The boy bolted. Stu swore under his breath and pushed to his feet. He wasn't planning on chasing him, not until he saw where the kid was running, straight into the wreckage of a downed ship. Stu stiffened. That wasn't just some abandoned ruin. The metal was still blackened from the crash, the hull split apart like a wound that had yet to scar. Recent meant not empty. His boots crunched against the sand as he followed, slower this time, more cautious. He slipped into the gaping wound of the ship's hull, the heat of the day still clinging to the metal. The inside was a tomb. Stu didn't need to check the other rooms to know that no one else had survived. The smell told him enough. Burnt circuitry, stale air, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. But there was something else here, something alive. His grip on his knife tightened as he moved deeper into the wreckage, scanning the shadows. Then, in the dim light, he saw her. She was slumped against the interior wall, her long white hair tangled, falling in loose waves around her face. Her blue skin was marked with bruises, deep dark patches spreading across her arms and legs. She had been injured badly, but it wasn't just from the crash. She had shielded someone. Stu's gaze flicked downward. The boy had dropped to his knees beside her, pressing the stolen ration pack into her hands. He was whispering something, his voice shaking, but she barely responded. She was still alive, barely. Stu inhaled slowly. He had seen this before, not just exhaustion. A body on the edge of survival, a mind refusing to shut down even when the body couldn't keep up. She needs more than that, Stu said quietly. The boy's head snapped up, his fingers curled around his mother's arm, his expression shifting from fear to defiance. Stu held up his hands, palms open. Easy, kid. I'm not here to take anything from you. No response. The woman stirred, just barely, her breath uneven. She tried to lift her head, but it took too much effort. Without a word, Stu unhooked the canteen from his belt and set it on the floor. Water, he said. Let her drink. The boy didn't trust him, that much was clear. But survival was stronger than pride. After a long, tense moment, the boy grabbed the canteen, his hands shaking as he lifted it to his mother's lips, tilting it carefully. She swallowed, slow, weak, but she swallowed. Stu let out a slow breath. His eyes flicked around the wreckage again. Something had brought this ship down. And if it was the storms, they weren't safe here. He settled against the doorway, watching the fading light outside. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Stu didn't sleep. He sat near the wreckage's entrance, his back against a half-melted support beam, legs stretched out, knife resting in his lap. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the scattered debris, carrying the scent of metal dust and something more primal, something alive. He could feel it now, that same sensation that had kept him breathing on other planets just like this, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the dark. Inside the wreckage, the child had curled up beside his mother, his small frame pressed against her as if his touch alone could keep her from slipping away. The boy was too thin, too exhausted to fight the sleep that eventually took him. The woman, though, she wasn't fully unconscious anymore. Stu could tell by the way her breathing had changed, the slight tension in her shoulders, the subtle flicker of movement beneath her eyelids. She was waking up. She didn't open her eyes right away. Instead, she listened. Smart. "You can stop pretending," Stu said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know you're awake." For a moment, she didn't react. Then finally her lashes lifted, revealing piercing, ice-pale eyes. She studied him, her gaze sharp despite the exhaustion weighing her down. She had the look of someone who had learned long ago that trust was dangerous. Stu wasn't offended. It was a lesson he had learned too. Her throat worked as she swallowed, her voice hoarse from dehydration when she finally spoke. "Who are you?" "Stu," he said simply. He nodded toward the sleeping boy beside her. "Your kid?" Her eyes flickered to the boy, softening for just a second. Yes, there was something in that one word, something layered beneath the exhaustion and pain. A quiet fierceness. She had fought to keep him alive. Stu had already suspected as much, but now he was certain. "You were on that ship when it went down?" he asked. A slow, shallow nod. "What happened?" She hesitated, her lips parted, but before she could speak, the storm hit. A deep, rolling growl of thunder rattled the wreckage around them, the wind slamming against the metal walls with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. The dry air became charged, filled with static, dust swirling in from every open crevice. The storm had come faster than he expected. Stu swore under his breath, moving toward the entrance to secure what little remained of the broken structure. It wouldn't hold if the winds got worse. Then, over the howl of the storm, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. Low, guttural, not thunder, not shifting wreckage, something else. Stu's grip on his knife tightened. Behind him, the woman stiffened. She heard it too. "They come at night," she murmured. Stu turned his head slightly. "Who?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to summon the strength to say the words. Then quietly she said, "The creatures." Stu exhaled slowly. Of course there were creatures. "Great," he muttered. Because starving wasn't bad enough. She didn't smile. She just watched him, her gaze unreadable. Another sound echoed through the storm, closer this time. Stu moved quickly, grabbing a rusted metal beam and dragging it across the entrance, securing the opening as best he could. It wouldn't stop anything determined, but it might buy them time. The woman struggled to sit up, her arms trembling under her own weight. She wasn't ready to move yet, but she was trying. Stu crouched beside her. "You can't fight in this condition." Her jaw clenched. "I don't have a choice." Stu met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "Yeah, you do." She blinked, caught off guard for just a moment. Then another sound, closer, a scraping noise just beyond the wreckage. Stu turned toward the sound, knife still in hand. They weren't alone. He exhaled slowly, bracing himself. "Fine," he murmured. "Let them come." The first attack came fast. Stu barely had time to process the movement before something plunged through the wreckage's open gap. A flash of dark, sinewy muscle and too many black, reflective eyes. It moved with an unnatural grace, its elongated limbs barely disturbing the sand as it launched toward him. He didn't think, he acted. His body moved on instinct, honed by years of surviving places just as merciless as this one. He threw himself to the side, rolling over jagged debris as clawed limbs slashed through empty air where his head had been. The impact of the creature's missed strike sent a blast of dust and shattered metal fragments flying. Stu hit the ground hard, shoulder first, his body twisting as he reached for his weapon. Not the knife this time, the rifle. His fingers found the worn grip just as the creature snapped toward him again. Stu leveled the gun, exhaled, and fired. The muzzle flashed, illuminating the dark wreckage in a brief, searing light. The sharp crack of the gunshot shattered the low howl of the wind. The round slammed into the creature's chest, punching through its thick hide. It let out a horrible, piercing shriek, a sound that sent a chill through Stu's spine. before staggering back, its many black eyes narrowing in a mixture of pain and confusion. But it didn't fall. Stu gritted his teeth. That should have killed it. The thing's chest still heaved, dark liquid oozing from the wound, but it kept moving. It lunged again, and this time Stu didn't have time to aim. He raised the rifle just as the creature slammed into him, sending them both crashing backward into the broken remains of a storage container. Metal crumpled beneath his weight. His back hit something sharp, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on keeping the snapping jaws from his throat. The creature thrashed, clawed limbs digging into his arms, but Stu pushed against its throat with the barrel of the rifle, using every ounce of strength to keep it at bay. The thing was strong, too strong. He had to end this now. With a grunt, he twisted his body, forcing the creature off balance for just a second. That second was all he needed. His left hand found his knife. He yanked it free from its sheath and drove it up into the soft flesh beneath the creature's jaw. The blade sank deep. The thing let out a final choked hiss before convulsing violently. Then it went still. Stu shoved it off him, his breath coming fast and rough. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the flickering emergency light above. His ribs ached, his muscles burned, and his heartbeat slammed against his skull. Then a second sound, a scraping noise, claws against metal. His body went rigid. That wasn't the wind. His instinct screamed at him to move, and he obeyed, rolling onto one knee and snapping the rifle up just as a second creature appeared at the entrance of the wreckage. This one was bigger, its body hunched low, its glowing black eyes scanning the interior, nostrils flaring as it scented the air. It was cautious, unlike the first. Stu's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, a sudden burst of red light flared in the darkness. The creature reeled back with a sharp, furious hiss. Stu blinked against the sudden brightness and turned his head. Seira. She was awake now, her body still weak, but her grip steady on the emergency flare in her hands. The brilliant chemical glow cast eerie shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp lines of her high cheekbones, the deep bruises along her arms. But she was upright and standing. The creature let out another angry screech, but refused to step forward. It backed away, uncertain, cautious. Seira took a slow step forward. Her stance was unsteady, her breath uneven, but she didn't falter. She raised the flare higher. "They fear fire," she murmured. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Stu exhaled, wiping blood from his lip. "Good to know." The creature watched them for another long second, then with a final guttural snarl, it turned and disappeared into the storm. The wind howled behind it, filling the sudden silence with its empty, ghost-like wail. Stu didn't lower his rifle immediately. His muscles stayed tense, waiting, watching. Nothing. For now. He let out a slow breath before looking at Seira again. She was paler than before, exhaustion written into every line of her face, but she hadn't let go of the flare. The way she held herself, even wounded, even on the edge of collapse, it was clear she had been a fighter once. Maybe she still was. Taran. The boy was pressed against the wall, his eyes wide, his small hands clenched into tight fists. The kid hadn't made a sound the entire fight. Stu exhaled and slung the rifle over his shoulder. The fight was over, but the night wasn't. Not by a long shot. He looked back at the creature's body, the first one he had killed. Its dark blood was already pooling across the cracked metal floor, staining the sand beneath. That wasn't good. The scent of blood would draw more. They didn't have long before something else showed up to investigate. Stu wiped a hand down his face, his exhaustion creeping in like a slow poison. Then finally he spoke. "We can't stay here." Seira looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. He turned to Taran next. The boy was still clutching his mother's arm, his breathing shallow. Stu crouched, leveling his gaze with the kids. "You're strong," he said, "but we're not safe yet. We have to move. Can you do that?" Taran hesitated, then nodded. Stu stood and turned back to Seira. "Can you walk?" She exhaled, her jaw tightening. Yes, it was a lie, but she would try anyway. And that was enough. Stu adjusted the rifle on his back, took one last look at the dead creature, then held out his hand to her. For a second, she just stared at it. Then finally, she took it. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. Outside, the storm raged. The wind carried with it the promise of more dangers, more things lurking in the sand. They didn't have time to rest. So they didn't. They moved. The storm was relentless. The wind howled through the ruins, shrieking through broken metal and shattered structures. Sand lashed at them from every direction, slipping beneath their clothes, stinging their skin like 1,000 tiny blades. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. The world was nothing but a shifting blur of red and gray. They kept moving. They had no choice. Seira struggled to keep up, though she didn't complain. She never did, but Stu could hear her uneven breathing, the soft, pained grunts she tried to hide. She was pushing herself beyond her limits. Taran, silent as always, clung tightly to her side. Too small, too young to be here. Stu glanced at them, at the way the boy held onto her like she was the only thing anchoring him to this world. Then he looked ahead through the swirling dust. A structure, half buried in the dunes, metal framework twisted with time, but it was still standing. Stu's pace quickened. There. They reached it just as the worst of the storm hit. The entrance was partially collapsed, jagged metal and debris blocking most of it, but there was a narrow opening, just big enough for them to slip through. Stu went first, rifle raised, scanning the interior. Dark, stale air, dust-covered equipment, long abandoned. No signs of life. Good. He turned back. Come on. Seira ducked inside, moving slowly. She nearly collapsed. Stu caught her, his hands wrapped around her arms, steadying her. For a moment she didn't move, just breathe. Her body leaned into his only for a second before she straightened on her own. I'm fine, she muttered. She wasn't, but Stu didn't argue. Taran slipped in last, pressing himself close to his mother. His small hands clutched the fabric of her torn clothing. Stu turned back to the space. It wasn't much, but it would do. A storage outpost, maybe, long abandoned. The roof was mostly intact, enough to block the worst of the storm. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and crouched down, running a hand over the floor. Sand had piled up in the corners, but it was dry, safe enough for now. Seira lowered herself against the wall, moving carefully. Her body trembled, too cold, too weak. She wouldn't last the night like this. Stu sighed, stripping off his jacket. Here. She blinked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his as she took it. Warm skin against cold, just a second, but Stu felt it. So did she. Seira pulled the jacket around herself, exhaling softly as warmth seeped into her body. Stu ignored the way something in his chest felt strangely tight and turned back to his pack. They needed food. He pulled out a ration pack and a metal canister of protein stew. Seira opened it. The scent of something vaguely edible filled the air. Taran stared at the food, the kind of stare Stu recognized. Hunger did that, made you quiet, made you afraid to hope. Stu broke off a piece of the ration bar and handed it to him. For her, he said simply. Taran hesitated, then took it. Stu crouched beside Seira, offering her the food directly. She looked at it, then at him. For a second, it seemed like she might refuse. Then slowly she accepted it. Her fingers brushed against his again, warmer this time. Eat, Stu muttered. You need it. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then finally took a bite. Stu sat back, watching her. She ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned to make food last. Thank you, she murmured. Stu looked away. He wasn't sure what to say to that. Instead, he focused on the space, scanning for anything useful. In the corner, something half buried under the sand. He moved toward it, brushing dust away. A heat generator. Stu exhaled. If it worked, it could save them. He pried open the panel. The power cell was weak but not dead. Come on, he muttered, adjusting the connections. A flicker of light, then a low humming. Warmth filled the air. Seira let out a soft breath, instinctively leaning toward it. Taran pressed closer to her, his small body finally relaxing. Stu sat down across from them, adjusting his rifle. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion settling in. Then he noticed Seira watching him, not with suspicion, not with fear. Something else. She shifted slightly, pulling his jacket tighter around herself. You said your name is Stu. He nodded. Her gaze lingered on him. You weren't born here, obviously. Obviously, Stu muttered. She studied him. Then why are you here? He hesitated. For a moment, he thought about lying. Then finally, he exhaled. Came with a salvage crew, he said. We were supposed to recover old wrecks. Got stranded when they left me behind. Seira's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened. She understood. Stu shrugged. That was a while ago. How long? Stu leaned back against the wall. Long enough. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Seira shifted again. You didn't have to help us, she murmured. Stu didn't respond right away. Maybe he should have walked away. Maybe that would have been smarter, but he hadn't. Finally, he just muttered, get some sleep. We move at first light. Seira held his gaze for a second longer. Then finally, she closed her eyes. Taran, already half asleep, curled against her side. Stu sighed, settling in against the opposite wall. Tomorrow they'd have to move, find real shelter. Tomorrow the danger would return, but tonight they were alive. And for now, that was enough. Stu woke before the first light. The outpost was silent, the air thick with a kind of stillness that made his instincts tighten. Something wasn't right. He sat up, rifle in hand, and listened. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world changed by the wind. The sand had shifted, burying some wreckage and revealing others. The air was thick with dust, still settling after the chaos of the night before. And somewhere in the distance, something moved. Stu's grip on his rifle tightened. He turned his head slightly, glancing towards Seira and Taran. They were still asleep, curled near the heat generator. The small flame inside flickered weakly, barely holding against the cold. Seira had shifted in the night, his jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. One sleeve had slipped, revealing bruises along her arms, the deep kind that told stories of impact and survival. She looked smaller like this, vulnerable in a way she refused to show when awake. Taran was pressed against her side, one hand gripping the fabric of her sleeve even in sleep, holding on. Stu exhaled slowly and pushed himself to his feet. They couldn't stay here. He moved toward the entrance, stepping carefully to avoid waking them. The doorway was half buried in sand from the storm. He tested it with his boot, feeling how loosely it packed under the weight. It wouldn't be hard to dig through when it was time to go. His eyes scanned the horizon, their movement near the ridge. Stu stiffened. It wasn't just shifting sand. Something or someone was out there. His jaw clenched. He turned back toward Seira. They needed to move now. He stepped closer, lowering himself into a crouch. Time to wake up. Seira stirred first. Her eyelashes fluttered before her eyes fully opened, still fogged with exhaustion. For a second, she looked unfocused, caught between sleep and reality. Then her gaze sharpened, fixing on him. She felt it too, the shift in the air, the wrongness of the silence. Taran groaned softly, curling further into her side. Seira brushed his hair back gently. Taran, she murmured, voice soft but firm, wake up, little one. Taran stirred but grumbled in protest, burying his face against her arm. Stu raised an eyebrow. Taran. Seira glanced at him, then nodded. Yes, my son. Stu looked between them, then smirked slightly. Fits him. She tilted her head. And why is that? Stu watched as Taran wiggled away from his mother's grip, rolling onto his stomach instead of sitting up, clearly resisting being awake. Because he's a little troublemaker. Seira exhaled a soft laugh, pressing a gentle but firm hand to Taran's back. He certainly is. Taran made a dramatic sound of complaint, voice muffled in his mother's sleeve. Not a troublemaker. Stu hummed. That's exactly what a troublemaker would say. Seira smiled, a small but real thing. It's true. He keeps me on my toes. Taran finally pushed himself upright, blinking sleepily at Stu. You talk too much, the boy muttered. Stu smirked. You sleep too much. Taran huffed but didn't argue. Stu glanced back at Seira. And you? She met his gaze. Seira, she said simply. Stu nodded slightly. Seira. Her name rolled off his tongue easily, like it belonged there. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition maybe, as if she realized that they had finally crossed a line from strangers to something else. Not yet friends, but not just survivors anymore. Stu exhaled and pushed himself up. We need to move. Seira's expression shifted instantly, the warmth from before replaced with focus. What? Stu glanced toward the ridge. Something's out there. She tensed. More creatures. Stu shook his head. Not sure. Could be scavengers. Could be worse. Taran sat up straighter at that, eyes wide. Worse? Seira gently hushed him, brushing a hand over his hair. We'll be fine, little one. Stu adjusted the strap of his rifle. There's a cave system a few miles west. If we push hard, we can make it by nightfall. Seira didn't hesitate. We'll keep up. Stu studied her, then nodded. He moved toward his pack, digging through what little supplies he had left. He pulled out a ration bar and a metal canister of protein stew. Seira reached out instinctively, not for herself but for Taran. She broke off a piece and placed it in his hands before taking a bite herself. Stu didn't miss it. She always put him first. When they finished, he adjusted his rifle again and turned to the entrance. "We move now. Stay close. If I say run, you run." Seira nodded once. "Understood." Taran clutched his mother's hand, staying close. Stu pushed through the sand-covered doorway, stepping out into the open. The landscape was different. The storm had carved deep trenches in the sand, revealing things that had been buried. Rusted metal, old wreckage, bones. But it wasn't the storm that worried him. It was the movement near the ridge, distant, almost too far to see. But it was there. Air. Not the creatures. Something else. Someone else. Stu's jaw tightened. They weren't alone. They had to move. The wasteland stretched before them, endless and unkind. The storm had passed, but the scorching heat remained, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The air was thick with dust, and each step sent small waves of sand cascading down uneven dunes. They had been walking for hours, pushing forward without rest, their only goal to reach the caves before nightfall. Stu led the way, his rifle strapped across his back, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Even though they had seen no signs of the creatures since leaving the outpost, his instincts told him they weren't alone. Seira and Taran followed close behind. She was struggling. Stu had noticed it early on, the way her breathing grew shallower, the way she adjusted her weight with each step, trying to avoid putting too much pressure on her injuries. She hadn't said a word about it, but she didn't need to. She was running on sheer willpower. Taran, for all his small size, was keeping up better than she was. His small feet left shallow imprints in the sand, his movements quiet, careful. But the way he kept glancing up at his mother, the flicker of worry in his wide, pale eyes told Stu that the kid knew something was wrong too. The silence between them stretched until finally Taran spoke. "How much farther?" Stu didn't look back. "Not much. Just keep moving." The boy made a soft sound of discontent, kicking at a rock. Seira squeezed his hand lightly. "We'll make it, little one." Taran sighed, still not convinced. Stu glanced back at Seira, at the way she held herself stiffly, her exhaustion barely concealed beneath a mask of quiet determination. He knew the type, the ones who never let themselves appear weak, no matter how much pain they were in. He had been one of them once. The terrain ahead sloped downward, broken chunks of rock and metal wreckage scattered across the sand. The path was uneven, treacherous. Stu moved carefully, stepping between loose stones. "Watch your footing here." Seira followed, one hand gripping Taran as they navigated the terrain. She was slower now, too slow. Then it happened. Her foot slipped on a loose rock, and suddenly she was falling. Taran gasped as Seira's body twisted sharply before she hit the ground. She landed hard on her side, sand kicking up around her as she let out a sharp cry of pain. Stu was at her side before she could even try to get up. Taran dropped to his knees beside her, his small hands gripping her arm. "Mama." His voice shook, fear laced into every syllable. Stu's gaze flickered down to her ankle, already swelling. "Bad." She tried to push herself up, but the second she put weight on her foot, she hissed in pain, her body trembling as she bit down on whatever she was about to say, refusing to show weakness. "Stop," Stu ordered. Seira lifted her head, a mixture of frustration and stubbornness flashing in her pale eyes. "I can walk." Stu gave her a flat, unimpressed look. "Like hell you can." Taran was still gripping his mother's arm, his small fingers tight as if he thought she might disappear if he let go. "She's hurt," he said, his voice breaking. Stu exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. The caves were still miles away. They couldn't afford to stop, which meant there was only one solution. Before Seira could protest, Stu leaned down and lifted her into his arms. She stiffened immediately, her hands pressing against his chest, startled by the sudden contact. "Put me down," she demanded, her voice sharp. "Not a chance." She tensed, her body warm against his, her breath catching slightly at the effortless weight he carried her. Taran looked up at them, his expression a mix of confusion and something else, something like awe. Stu adjusted his grip, his arms firm beneath her legs and back, holding her securely. She was lighter than he expected, her body too thin from days of hunger and exhaustion. "You're—" She exhaled sharply, her fingers unintentionally gripping the fabric of his shirt. "You don't have to do this." Stu arched an eyebrow. "You want to crawl to the caves?" Her lips parted, but no retort came. Stu smirked slightly. "That's what I thought." She huffed but stopped fighting him. Taran walked beside them, still staring. After a long moment, the boy grinned. I knew it, Taran said suddenly. Stu glanced down. Knew what? Taran's eyes sparkled mischievously. You like my mama. Seira groaned. Stu nearly tripped. He quickly recovered, adjusting his hold on her as she covered her face with one hand. Taran, now is not the time. Taran giggled. Seira sighed, dropping her hand. Taran, be quiet. But I was right, he muttered, clearly pleased with himself. Stu shook his head. Seira avoided his gaze, but her cheeks were slightly flushed. Silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't tense. The air between them had shifted. The friction, the guarded distance, it was still there, but something was different now. Stu's hold on her was secure, steady. Her warmth pressed against him, the scent of sand and something subtly floral lingering on her skin. For the first time, she wasn't just tolerating his presence. She was trusting him. She let out a small breath, her body relaxing slightly against his chest. Stu felt it, the moment the walls between them started to lower. He held her a little tighter, just for a second. Neither of them said a word, but they both felt it. They weren't just surviving together anymore. They were in this together. The caves swallowed them whole the moment Stu, Seira, and Taran passed the entrance. The world outside faded into suffocating darkness. The air was damp, thick with the scent of wet stone and old decay. The ground was uneven beneath their feet, loose gravel shifting with every step. Seira leaned against him more heavily now, her body warm and trembling from exertion. She was trying to mask it, trying to carry her own weight despite her injury. But for Triclod hit the max length for a message and has paused his response. You can write continue to keep the chat going.